The day Xyler beamed down to Earth was supposed to be simple. A diplomatic mission, a few pleasantries, a treaty or two. Nothing his kind hadn't done 1,000 times before. It was his first time taking the lead role, though. There was an element of pride mixed in with his innate sense of duty. His superiors in the galactic Concordance saw promise in him, and here he was, poised to represent his species on a new, burgeoning world. Stepping out of the transport pod, I felt a shiver go down my exoskeleton. It wasn't the cold, we had temperature regulators for all sorts of climates. It was the weight of anticipation, of knowing that how this went might echo in the Concordance for centuries to come. "We're ready for you, Ambassador Xyler," crackled a voice from a small black box. I recognized it as a rudimentary translation device. Good enough for basic conversation. "Likewise," I replied, trying to keep the tremors out of my voice. A group of beings in brightly tailored fabric approached humans, by the briefing. Short and bipedal, with an odd assortment of fur on their heads. Not a single one of them possessed the smooth cranial ridge of proper sentience, but our preliminary scans detected the right patterns of electrical activity. There were 5 of them. One held out a 5-fingered appendage in an odd gesture. I consulted my datapad, then hesitantly raised my own hand and extended 3 fingers to meet theirs. "Welcome to Earth," the human grinned, "I'm President Harper." The next several hours passed in a flurry of diplomatic jargon that, thankfully, the translator seemed to handle well. What I hadn't expected was the barrage of questions after the formal introductions were out of the way. "Tell me, Ambassador, how do your ships stay aloft for extended periods? Can you describe how your bodies synthesize nutrients? What sort of societal structure do you have on your homeworld?" Every query was a sharp little reminder of how little they knew. But my instructions were clear: patience, transparency, the careful doling out of knowledge to foster trust. After what felt like an eternity, the question period wound down, and they led me from the sterile landing site to a sprawling set of buildings. The architecture was blunt, all harsh angles and reflective surfaces. Impressive in size, yes, but it lacked the organic flow I was accustomed to, the symbiotic blending of form with function. I'd spent enough time amongst budding species to recognize the signs. In their structures, their clothing, even their language, there was a relentless, even desperate need to exert order upon the chaos of reality. It hinted at a deep-seated fragility. By the time we reached a room set aside for negotiations, I was exhausted. The humans were just getting started. We sat in a half-circle of chairs. Why chairs? As they brought in devices of all shapes and sizes. "Ambassador," President Harper began, clasping her hands on the table. "Why a table? We are eager to learn. We've studied the scans of your physiology, and well." She blinked a few times. "It's confusing." I chuckled. Confusing was an understatement. Most of my kind had additional limbs, multiple hearts, bioluminescent markings for communication. To most species, we seemed a jumbled mess. Yet, here we were, undeniable proof that sentience wasn't beholden to a single template. "President Harper, as I understand it, your scientists have been particularly perplexed by your own genetic structure, is that correct?" I asked. Harper shifted in her seat. "Yes. There seem to be huge portions that they don't seem to do anything. We call it junk DNA." An alarm went off in the back of my mind. Junk DNA. There was no such thing. That term fell out of scientific use 5 millennia ago. Every strand, every nucleotide, had a reason for existing, even if we didn't yet know it. I leaned forward, unable to contain my curiosity. "You haven't been able to find any function at all within these sequences?" A middle-aged scientist, Dr. Singh if I recalled his name tag, shook his head. "None. They don't produce proteins, they don't regulate other genes. We've run every analysis we can think of, and they appear completely inert." This was baffling, and, if I was honest, exhilarating. No species the Concordance encountered had this anomaly. What could it mean? But I wasn't here to solve genetic riddles. We had to stick to the plan. "Perhaps," I ventured cautiously, "this is an area where our technology can assist. May I see the data?" The humans looked at each other, hesitation flickering across their faces. It was understandable. After all, what species would willingly hand over their deepest biological secrets to a stranger? But there was an undercurrent of desperation beneath the caution, a sense that they were clinging to straws just out of reach. "Ambassador," President Harper finally said, "I won't lie. This junk DNA, it haunts us. It feels like an evolutionary oversight, a flaw. Are you sure your technology can help us figure it out?" It was a question loaded with vulnerability. Here was a young species, already starting to doubt itself, unsure of its place in the cosmic scheme of things. If I could help them find the answer within themselves, it might do more than secure a treaty, it might help them find their footing in the galaxy. President Harper, scientific breakthroughs don't happen on a schedule. But, I can promise that our geneticists will prioritize this. They are the best in the Concordance, and they would be honored to dedicate their resources to solving this mystery. I watched the relief wash over them and inwardly resolved to get started as soon as possible. A flurry of activity followed. Data pads and portable drives appeared. Screens flickered with incomprehensible lines of genetic code. Within an hour, a secure transmission was sent to Concordance Prime, along with a priority tag that made my superiors balk, undoubtedly. Yet, the potential of this discovery was worth a few ruffled feathers. The next several days were a whirlwind. I barely saw my own quarters, spending long hours poring over the data alongside a team of the top human geneticists. There was camaraderie despite the linguistic and cultural barriers, a shared sense of awe as we peered into the very blueprint of another species. And yet, there was nothing. Just as the humans had warned, the junk section seemed devoid of meaning. My Concordance colleagues, initially enthusiastic, began to voice their doubts. This was a wild goose chase, they claimed. We were wasting resources. Ignoring the naysayers, I dove deeper. Then came the breakthrough. It wasn't a discovery of a gene, nor a hidden protein, but a pattern. Dr. Singh pointed it out, his voice trembling slightly. Look here, segments repeat in a seemingly random fashion. And look, there are subtle variations between individuals. This could have been it, a species-specific identifier, perhaps. Or it could still be nothing. I needed more context. Cross-referencing their archives, I pulled up evolutionary records, population data, even ancient medical texts. Something started to coalesce, a nebulous idea that made my hearts flutter with anticipation. President Harper, Dr. Singh. I addressed them as formally as I could, unable to contain my excitement. I believe we may be looking at this all wrong. They leaned forward, a flicker of hope sparking in their eyes. Tell me, I continued, my voice carefully measured, your ancestors, what were their lives like before technology and modern medicine? How did they survive in, what I understand to be, a fairly harsh environment? Harper and Singh exchanged puzzled glances. Well, Harper started slowly, life was shorter, more brutal. Disease, famine, predators. Constant threats. And were any individuals, or groups, inherently better at surviving these hardships? I pressed on. Singh furrowed his brow. Some adapted better to specific climates or had stronger immune systems, yes. It clicked. Those differences, those subtle advantages. I believe they may be encoded right here, in what you call junk DNA. Tell me, do you have historical records of individuals who seem to possess unusual abilities? Strength, rapid healing, even things attributed to luck? President Harper was frowning. There are myths, legends. But we dismiss them as exaggeration. Myths are the memories of generations, I countered. A long silence fell before Singh spoke. We have archives dating back centuries. It would take time to sift through them. But they did it. Within mere days, they unearthed stories whispered down through generations. A tribal chieftain with uncanny night vision. A woman who survived a plague that wiped out her entire village. A man known for his unexplainable ability to know when danger lurked. Each story was a breadcrumb. When we cross-referenced them with historical genealogical records and focused on the junk regions, the patterns became evident. Inactive segments, passed down in a dormant state. Until they weren't. Under the right pressures, some tiny switch was flipped, a hidden code awakened. It wasn't magic. It was evolutionary resilience, coded so subtly that the humans hadn't even recognized it within themselves. My mind reeled with the implications. Their junk DNA wasn't a flaw, but a vault filled with dormant potential, waiting to be unlocked. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. First through the scientific community on Earth, then echoing across the Concordance transmission network. Initially, there was disbelief, even mockery. The very idea that junk DNA could harbor untapped potential seemed too fantastical. But faced with the overwhelming evidence, the tide turned. Wonder replaced skepticism, and then came a desperate hunger for knowledge. Suddenly, the humans held the key that every species in the galaxy craved, the ability to shape their own evolution. My role shifted instantly. I was no longer just a diplomat, but a gatekeeper to biological secrets older than the Concordance itself. Requests flooded in. Offers of trade, bribes veiled as collaborative research, even thinly disguised threats. The humans were overwhelmed, unsure of how to proceed. It fell to me to play the delicate game of keeping other powers at bay while somehow safeguarding the human race from exploitation. Ambassador Zyler, President Harper's voice was strained when she contacted me. "We need your advice. This has gotten out of hand." I understood. They were staring down the barrel of a future where the highest bidder dictated the fate of their species. It wasn't a scenario any member of the Concordance would condone. "There is only one way to ensure your autonomy," I explained to her and a hastily assembled council of scientists and politicians. "The Concordance must formally recognize this as a sentient, evolving genetic lineage, separate from baseline humanity." This, I knew, was a gamble. Sentience wasn't merely brain activity, it was an implied right to self-determination, protection under countless treaties. If granted, their dormant genes would become, in essence, their own living, inalienable heritage. But the risk of other species trying to claim a stake? That was untenable. There was pushback. Some argued that bestowing sentient status on a bunch of inactive genes was reckless, a mockery of the term. They wanted control, a say in how this new knowledge was disseminated. I fought every objection, painting a vivid picture of the horrors that awaited them if they became mere pawns. In the end, they relented. It helped that the Concordance, alerted to the potential fallout, officially endorsed the claim. The announcement reverberated across planets. Overnight, Earth became a place both celebrated and feared. Humans with dormant potential were declared a protected subspecies, and I was placed in an unprecedented role as a liaison, tasked with monitoring all research, negotiations, and knowledge transfer. And here's where the plot takes its twist. One evening, amidst the endless bureaucracy and diplomatic squabbles, a geneticist named Dr. Tanaka handed me a datapad. Her face was pale. "Ambassador," she whispered, "I think I just uncovered something huge. And terrifying." On the screen were gene sequences from multiple Concordance species, mine included. Familiar patterns stared back at me, not random repeats, but the very same variations found within human junk DNA. "What does this mean?" I breathed, a cold dread settling over me. "It means," Dr. Tanaka said slowly, "that we're not the exception. It means all those dormant segments, they're in all of us. The potential for change. It's a universal trait." The implications hit me like a meteor. This discovery wasn't just about the humans. It was about every sentient being in the galaxy. The Concordance had been founded on principles of stability, of maintaining the carefully evolved order of things. Yet, the very notion of a species was now fluid, the potential for unforeseen leaps in evolution hanging over our heads. Did those dormant switches exist for a reason? Was this some grand evolutionary plan, or a time bomb hidden in our genomes? I had just helped one species navigate these perilous waters, but now, the entire Concordance was at risk. We weren't just observers anymore, we were participants in a galactic experiment that might rewrite the very rules of existence. In the quiet of my personal quarters, the immensity of Dr. Tanaka's discovery crashed over me. For the first time in millennia, the Concordance seemed fragile. All our treaties, our systems of governance, our very belief in a predictable universe, it all teetered on the brink of irrelevance. How do you regulate evolution? How do you negotiate with forces encoded in your very being? The responsibility I already bore towards the humans now paled in comparison to the galaxy-wide crisis looming ahead. This wasn't just about the future of one species, but the survival of an entire way of life. My first instinct was to inform my superiors, but a chilling realization held me back. The Concordance prided itself on order and transparency. This discovery, however, was pure chaos, and the risk of panic was too great. I needed more information, needed to understand the scale of what we were dealing with, and I needed to do it without raising immediate alarm. Under the guise of aiding ongoing research on Earth, I put in requests with the top geneticists across the Concordance, prioritizing those who had access to archival samples from diverse species. The waiting game was agonizing. With each passing day, the sense of impending upheaval grew stronger. Then, the trickle of data turned into a flood. Dr. Tanaka had been right. The dormant sequences weren't a human anomaly. They existed throughout the Concordance, nestled within the genomes of countless species like ticking time bombs. Worse, they weren't merely dormant. Analysis of older archival samples revealed subtle variations, micromutations triggered seemingly by random events in the distant past. Plagues, environmental shifts, even technological advancements correlated with changes in those once inert segments. Evolution was whispering in every gene, waiting for the right stimulus to unlock a whole new chorus of voices. The implications were staggering. Individuals developing unforeseen physiological advantages. Entire populations spontaneously adapting to previously uninhabitable planets. Species diverging at an unprecedented rate. Or even converging. What if that shared potential meant that the lines we so carefully drew in the cosmos were, in fact, drawn in sand? Faced with this, my role morphed from liaison to one that felt frighteningly familiar: protector. Only now, it was not just one vulnerable species who needed shielding, but the whole precarious balance of the Concordance. The first step was containment. Under various pretexts, I stalled research efforts aimed at deliberately triggering dormant sequences. It was a risky game, playing dumb to buy time. I sabotaged communication channels, fudged records, and even outright lied, all in the name of forestalling the inevitable. It couldn't last. Too many were asking the right questions, and I was spreading myself impossibly thin. I needed a plan, a grand strategy that went beyond just putting out fires and playing for time. Yet, what could one being do against the tides of evolution itself? Then came the epiphany. It began as a desperate spark. What if the key to controlling this evolutionary explosion didn't lie in suppression, but in control? I dove into the accumulated data with a newfound focus. My kind had a long, complex history with genetic manipulation, though we'd long ago abandoned its use as ethically fraught. Was this the moment to dust off those forbidden skills? I began to envision a network, hidden and meticulously monitored, designed not to stifle evolutionary change, but to guide it. Identifying at-risk species, studying environmental factors, subtly nudging genomic shifts towards safe and stable pathways. In effect, becoming galactic gardeners, tending the wild growth springing from our very DNA. The thought frightened me. It was the epitome of playing God. Yet, the alternative, uncontrolled chaos leading to the fracturing of the Concordance, or even extinction events, was far worse. This was a gamble on a scale I'd never dared imagine, but inaction had become the greatest gamble of all. Armed with an audacious plan and a heavy dose of desperation, I set out to build my secret network. I started with the humans. In them, I saw the potential for allies. They were still reeling from the initial shock of their discovery and were understandably wary. But unlike some other species I'd encountered, their instinct wasn't control, but understanding. I approached Dr. Tanaka first. Despite our differing agendas, I saw in her a thirst for knowledge untouched by the taint of ambition. In her eyes, evolution was still a thing of wonder, not a weapon. Slowly, cautiously, I revealed more than she bargained for: the extent of the dormant sequences, their presence throughout the Concordance, and the chaos it portended. She was horrified, but not in the way the power-hungry would have been. She saw not only the potential for upheaval, but the terrifying ethical quagmire that came with it. After a long, sleepless night, she looked at me with fierce determination. "I don't like this, Ambassador," she stated, "but I understand the necessity. I'm in. If we can build your network right, maybe there's a way to turn this into a force for good, not control." With Tanaka's help, it became easier to recruit others, not just among the human scientists, but from select, trusted contacts throughout the Concordance. My reputation helped. They knew me as a fair negotiator, a voice of reason. I spoke vaguely of unknown evolutionary threats and the need for proactive monitoring. It was thin cover, but enough to secure the cooperation of geneticists, biologists, and ecologists who shared my mounting sense of unease. The network took shape in hidden corners of the galactic communication channels. We developed ciphers, coded protocols, and an elaborate system of safeguards, all while maintaining our official, open-faced work. Each member knew only a fragment of the whole, with me alone holding the complete picture. We were a shadow organization committed to a cause that couldn't see the light of day. The first few years were tense. We monitored evolutionary patterns, cross-referenced threats and events, and developed intricate contingency plans. Where we could, we subtly diverted research away from pathways that seemed primed for sudden, destabilizing change. A grant request for a risky experiment mysteriously lost here, a critical piece of equipment malfunctioning there. It was a delicate dance, and I knew we couldn't keep it up forever. But I'd underestimated how quickly the dormant sequences could react. The first incident struck a remote research colony on the edge of Concordance space. The species were avian-like, known for quick adaptability. Yet, the transformation I received reports of was far too rapid, too extreme. Within weeks of exposure to an experimental compound, their young were being born with altered respiratory systems, adapted to the colony's failing atmosphere. This was evolution at a breakneck speed, not due to gradual environmental pressures, but seemingly triggered by a specific chemical. By the time we caught on, it was too late. The change was propagating throughout their population. The panic was immediate. Concordance officials descended on the colony, containment protocols were activated, and all research on the implicated compound halted. This was precisely the kind of uncontrolled chaos I had feared, and worse, it was proof that deliberate activation of dormant sequences was frighteningly possible. After initial damage control and an excruciating investigation, I found myself facing a grim-faced council of my Concordance superiors. I'd overstepped, they knew that. My requests for increasingly specialized equipment, my constant troubleshooting trips, it all added up to a picture far greater than what they'd been led to believe. Ambassador Zyler, the High Consul's tone was a whipcrack. We were told these threats were hypothetical. And so they were at the time, I said, holding her icy gaze. Things escalated. You have engaged in a level of secrecy that borders on treason, accused another. I have protected the Concordance from dangers you could not have fathomed even a year ago, I fired back. A wave of unease swept through the council. They knew, vaguely, that something was amiss. I saw it in the way they eyed each other, in the increased security surrounding key research facilities. The cat was peeking out of the bag, and it was only a matter of time before it ran loose. I cannot condone your actions, Ambassador, stated the High Consul, yet, I can no longer deny the irregularity of the situation. I will convene the wider assembly. The assembly was the highest governing body in Concordance. It was a body I was meant to answer to, not face as a defendant pleading an impossible case. But here I was, all my secret maneuverings, my moral compromises laid bare under the harsh light of ultimate judgment. I had two options: tell the whole, horrifying truth and risk a cascade of uncontrollable consequences, or continue my deception in the desperate hope I could still gain a measure of control. The chamber where the assembly met was cavernous, lined with representatives of countless species. It was an awe-inspiring testament to the ideals of the Concordance, and the very place where those ideals were about to be tested. As I stood before them, feeling the weight of countless eyes on me, I knew my next words would not only decide my fate but would likely rewrite the future of every sentient being in the galaxy.